Hello again, and welcome to the final lecture in the MBA 5302 course. And in this time we'll take one last look at some macroeconomic topics, specifically taxation and government spending. We're looking to just get a basic overview of the tax system and think about some implications of tax policy for entrepreneurship and the broader economy. So let's start off by taking a look at the numbers. And by the way, all the numbers provided in this lecture come from this great website, usgovernmentspending.com. And it's just a repository of official government data for spending, revenue, debts, for all levels of government, state, local, federal. It is a little hard to navigate because there's so much information on it, but what I've done is clipped and got some screenshots of some of the data and put it into my PowerPoint slides. Okay, so we'll start off by just looking at federal taxation, federal revenue numbers, and notice in this chart that federal data is in this first column here. So we have total direct revenue of $3.3 trillion. The biggest chunk of that by far is the personal income tax. That's right here. That's $1.9 trillion. Oh, and I should note that the income taxes category here, that includes the personal and corporate income taxes. The next biggest at $1.1 trillion is social insurance taxes. Now, that's really just another form of income tax. That's your payroll tax, your Medicare Social Security tax. So your ad valorem taxes would be your federal excise taxes on things like gasoline, alcohol, and whatnot. Business and other revenue would be user fees and proceeds of sales of government assets and that sort of thing. Okay, so you can see that there's not that many sources of government revenue, and really all of them are income taxes. A vast bulk of the federal revenues falls in the form of either personal income and payroll taxes or corporate income taxes. So let's take a brief look at these big items in the federal tax system. The payroll tax, FICA, Federal Insurance Contributions Act. You've probably seen this reference on your pay stub. It's taken automatically out of people's paychecks. There's less grumbling from the peasants that way. This was enacted to fund Social Security back in the 1930s, and Medicare, which was implemented in the 1960s with its own payroll tax. And it's currently, as of mid-2016, a combined 15.3% tax, but it only hits your pay up to $117,000. So this is odd in the American system, which features heavy progressivity of income tax rates, which we'll look at here in a minute, and that once your income crosses a certain threshold, you're no longer subject to the payroll tax. So this is actually what's known as a regressive tax. You do pay it on your first dollar. There's no exemptions or deductions from the payroll tax. And the way it's structured is that it's technically levied half on the employee and half on the employer, and that's how the current breakdown works. So 6.2% for employee and employer of the Social Security tax, and then 1.45% for both employee and employer for the Medicare component. And all of that adds up to 15.3%. So every worker, every payroll worker in America is paying this income tax regardless of the income level, 15.3%. Okay, and as mentioned, the payroll tax is regressive. The effective tax rate decreases as your income goes up, especially if you cross that $117,000 threshold beyond which payroll tax no longer hits your income. Let's move on to the personal income tax, and I'm not going to say a whole lot about it. I'm just going to give a very brief overview because it is extremely complicated. Here is the chart of the pages in the federal tax code from the beginning of the income tax in 1913. You'll notice it started at 400 pages and it's been steadily expanded over time, particularly in the 80s and 90s, and we're to the point now, this is as of 2013, where we have 74,000 pages in the tax code. That's because it's filled with all sorts of what some people derisively refer to as loopholes, exemptions, deductions, tax credits, special tax breaks for all sorts of things, and really the government is now using the income tax for more than just revenue collection. It's using it to subsidize particular groups of people, particular spending, to dole out certain kinds of welfare programs. So it's just a very hairy, complex taxation system. It's progressive tax. Tax rate goes up as your income goes up on your marginal income, on the extra chunk of income above each threshold level in the tax bracket system. So we've got 7 brackets currently, and here they are. I'm not going to go through this in detail. If you are interested, you can pause it and study it, but basically, for very low incomes, you're paying a rate of just 10%, and for income above that level, it jumps to 15, up to 37,000. This is maybe your kind of your middle class income levels right here. They're paying 25% only on income between these two levels. Okay, then it jumps up to 28% above 90,000, 33%, 35%, and then we have a top marginal rate of 39.6% only on the income earned above $400,000. 30 plus deductions, and deductions of course reduce your income. It's kind of the equivalent to a business writing off expenses, but for the household. Here's a summary categorization of those I got this from the IRS website. You can deduct work-related expenses if you're self-employed. You can deduct investment losses. You can deduct education expenses, healthcare expenses, charitable donations, and on it goes. This is why some people require the help of highly trained and highly paid tax professionals when it comes time to file their taxes. 20 plus credits, and credits are treated as if you had paid that tax already, and most of them are refundable. So if you rack up tax credits, even if you have a tax liability, you might still get a check back from the IRS. In that case, it's a tax refund. And here's a listing of the credits. There's all kinds of policy goals being pursued through tax credits, child tax credits, adoption credits, health insurance tax credits. In fact, the Obamacare, you might remember, there was some controversy about this, and a Supreme Court decision ultimately settled this, but the penalty mechanism for the individual health insurance mandate within Obamacare is enforced through the tax code. A lot of things have been grafted onto the tax code, and it becomes a vehicle for accomplishing all kinds of other policies. There's some welfare type policies, there's some income support type policies like the earned income tax credit. There's some housing policy elements in here. The mortgage interest credit, that's a big one. And there's a lot of lobbying support for that in the real estate industry and the mortgage lending industry. There's some energy policy things in here with energy efficient policies. There's some transportation policy items in here with credits for electric cars and whatnot. We have a long and growing list of credits and deductions, most of which function as vehicles for various interest groups and constituencies to accomplish certain policy goals. Okay. And then of course we have exemptions, which are like deductions, but they're always fixed amounts. And we go on and on, get into the nitty-gritty here, but let's just summarize. The upshot is that as your income goes up, your tax rate goes up in a progressive system, but the average tax rate is always lower than the marginal because of that progressivity. And here's a chart that shows in red the marginal rate, so you can see income is on the horizontal and the tax rate paid is on the vertical. So as your income goes up, you cross the threshold level and your tax rate jumps up. Of course, that marginal rate is only paid on income in this tier. So you pay 10% on the income in the lowest tier, you pay 15% on income in this tier, you pay 25% tax on income in that tier, so on and so forth. So the average rate, which is in blue here, labeled as the effective rate, is always going to be lower than that highest marginal rate, but it does approach that highest marginal rate as your income grows. These people up here earning more than $1 million are paying 39.6% on all the income between $600,000 and $1 million. Okay, so if you earn $10 million of ordinary income, only the first $400,000 is taxed at a lower rate, but the last $9.6 million is taxed at this high rate. So you're effectively paying almost 39.6% on all your income, and that's why the effective rate here continues to rise, and it never quite reaches, but it would approach that top marginal rate. Okay, now here's some actual data, and this is, I believe I clipped this out of the Wall Street Journal recently for 2014, of the share of total income taxes in the U.S. that are being paid by different income groups. The reason I want to bring this to mind is that there's a constant refrain whenever we're in a tax policy debate, and we're coming up on a presidential election here, so actually by the time we see this video it might have just passed, God help us all, but you'll constantly hear people talking about the rich should pay their fair share. Well, here's a picture of what the rich, or what the high income people in the country are paying. The top fifth of income earners, the top 20% of households with respect to their income, and that's above $134,000 per year income, they're earning just about half of all income in the country. They are paying about 84% of all personal income tax. So when it comes to are the rich paying their fair share or not, I don't know what fair means, and I can't determine that. But I do know that they are paying well more than their share of all the income that they earn. Well more than their share. These what we might call the middle class income levels in here, they're earning about 15% of income, and they're only paying 6% of personal income taxes. Steeply progressive, and there's a big question of how much more progressive it could become without really straining the incentives of these higher income earners to continue earning. Now, zooming in on that top 20%, we can see that it's even more skewed within that range. Look at the top 1% earning incomes above $600,000. That's 17% of all income earned in the country, and they alone are paying almost half of all federal income taxes. That's just 3 million people by themselves shouldering nearly half of the burden of the income tax. This next 4%, earning between $260,000 and $600,000, earning 12% of all the income, paying 18% of all the taxes. That's just 13 million people. So the idea here is that we already do have taxation of income focused heavily on the top income groups. And that makes sense. They're the ones making most of the income, so naturally that's where most of the taxes are going to fall. higher income households in the U.S. are currently paying a highly disproportionate share of the federal income tax. Okay, one issue with the complexity of the tax code is the issue of compliance costs. I just want to lay this out for you in terms of kind of helping you become aware of some of the problems that our tax system imposes on us. And I got some quotations from several different groups here: Tax Foundation, the National Taxpayers Union, the Mercatus Center. All of these are economic research organizations or think tank type organizations. And I just want to note here that they have estimates that range from 37 billion to 130 billion. This one goes from 250 maybe to 900 plus billion, almost a trillion, of compliance costs. This is the cost associated just with filling out the forms, managing the deductions, hiring tax professionals to help people minimize their tax burdens, hiring attorneys, and so on and so forth. So there's a strong argument in favor of simplifying the tax code. If we didn't spend scarce resources with alternative uses, kind of messing around with trying to minimize our tax burden, well, that would be more scarce resources to enjoy for consumption and investment purposes, to employ workers, to produce goods, to increase economic growth, rather than just to shuffle papers, so to speak, to try to minimize the bureaucratic bite out of our incomes. Okay, and one last point I should note when it comes to just getting a general overview of U.S. tax policy is the issue of double taxation of corporate income. Corporate net income currently taxed at 35%. Who are corporations? Well, as a previous presidential candidate famously said,
and there are various ways of doing that. One is we could raise taxes on people. That's not the way. Corporations are people, my friend. We can raise taxes on. Of course they are. Everything corporations earn ultimately goes to people. So, where do you think it goes? What? Whose pockets? Whose pockets? People's pockets. Okay, human beings, my friend.
So regardless of what else you might think about former candidate Mitt Romney, he was absolutely dead on correct in his identification there in the face of those somewhat economically ignorant hecklers. Corporations are people, in the sense that people own corporations, typically through stock. There's other forms of ownership, and the people who own corporations are the ones who earn the income and therefore the ones who suffer from the increased taxes. When you increase taxes on corporations, you're effectively increasing taxes on those individuals who own the corporations, either through stock or other mechanisms. So we have a policy that taxes corporate net income initially at 35%, but then also taxes individual income in the form of dividends, again at 15%. Actually, I think that's gone up since 2012. For every $100 of corporate net income, then, if they decide to pay it all out to their shareholders, you can see that there's only 55 remaining. So our effective tax rate here, if a corporation chooses to pay dividends, the effective tax rate is about 45%. We're taxing income once at the corporate level, and then we're taxing it again at the individual level. But that's the same income. It's just being passed through from the corporation to its owners. So one of our big problems, in my view, is this double taxation issue. And if we want to talk about tax reform that will encourage economic growth and investment, this is one of the main priorities that I would suggest we need to tackle. Either reduce the corporate rate such that the double taxation problem isn't as steep, or completely eliminate taxes on capital gains. We won't get into the weeds of the tax policy debate. I just wanted to, again, make you aware of these issues. These are the main things to know about, just in a very broad sense, when it comes to the U.S. federal tax landscape. Okay, now I've suggested that our tax code is complex and messy, and it's trying to do more than just raise taxes. And if you're guessing that Professor Watts is not too happy with the American income tax system, you'd be right. Now, I don't want to endorse a specific reform policy here, but I do want to mention a few of the big ideas that are circulating out there and just give you, again, a sense of the debate and the issue. So let me run through some tax reform ideas here for you and just kind of help you get a sense of outlines of the discussion. Now, one of the oldest tricks in the tax reform book is the idea of tax rate cuts. What's the purpose of tax rate cuts? Well, in economics we have this saying, if you tax something you get less of it. You're taxing income with the income tax, so that means you get less income. And how do people earn income? That's right, by working. So the idea here is that taxation is a huge disincentive for working, and hence is very bad for the economy. So we could have some economic stimulus and some encouragement for people to work more, earn more, produce more, invest more, and grow the economy more if we cut back the amount the government taxes their incomes. The idea of tax rate cuts, we'll put this under the heading of supply-side economics, is that lower rates will increase people's incentives to work and earn and start businesses, invest, and grow the economy. Supply-siders like to use the phrase lower the rate, broaden the base, give lower tax rates, encourage more people to work. So you actually might have more taxpayers at the end of this cycle. And that leads to an interesting potential revenue effect, and Thomas Sowell talks about this extensively in our textbook. So I want to kind of reinforce that discussion. If we cut taxes, what happens to government revenue? Well, the obvious answer is, well, people will be paying less taxes, so government revenue will go down, but that's actually often not the case. And in several times in our history, we have observed that when tax rates go down, tax revenues go up because more people are working. So even though people are paying on average lower tax rates, there's enough more people working that the government winds up collecting more revenue, and that there's a big enough boost in the economic growth rate that the overall economy, the overall tax base grows enough to actually increase government revenue in the long run. And this was the case made by the famous economist, one of the supply side revolutionaries behind the Reagan tax cuts of the 1980s, Arthur Laffer. And here's Art back in the early 1980s explaining with a concept called the Laffer curve how tax rate cuts could actually lead to increase in government revenue. I'll just kind of follow along on his chalkboard drawing here. What he's got on the vertical axis is the tax rate, and that bottoms out down here at 0%, and then on the horizontal axis you've got government revenue. Well, if the tax rate is 0%, government revenue is, guess what, 0%. 0 times anything is 0. But at the opposite extreme, where the tax rate's 100%, government revenue is, guess what, $0. Because the idea here is that with rational, self-interested individuals, nobody's going to work for the government for free. I'm not going to work only to have the government take every dollar I earn and go home with nothing for my family. It doesn't mean people won't work, it just means that people might look for under-the-table, black market type activities, underground economy, which tends to be much less inefficient than the formal economy. So not only does this hurt government revenue, but it hurts overall productivity and prosperity. Okay. So the idea is here that the government can start to raise the tax rate, up to 5, 10, 15%. And even though people don't like paying taxes, that's relatively low enough that they'll probably keep working as much as they did. You have a pretty minimal disincentive effect here. And so government revenue will start growing. And that only goes up to a point. Above a certain point, Laffer and the supply-siders are going to suggest that the incentive effect becomes prohibitive. You can see here's Laffer's terminology here, prohibitive. Okay. So you cross a certain threshold, the disincentive effect is now outweighing the effect of higher rates, and so government revenue turns and starts to taper off until you hit that 100% rate level at which the government's going to collect nothing. I might argue that the government might collect nothing as soon as you hit an 80 or 90%. And by the way, we're talking about average tax rates over here, not marginal rates. Okay. The effective or the average tax rate is the operative tax rate when we're thinking about this kind of phenomenon of rate cuts and government revenue. So what is this optimal rate here that maximizes government revenue? Your goal is not necessarily to maximize government revenue. Now, if you're the Secretary of the Treasury, that's prudent because the Secretary's job is to pay all the government's bills. So some people within government might want to know what this number is. Economists, they want to know the number that maximizes economic growth, probably. It might also be this number. Well, rule of thumb is that it's probably somewhere around a 25% average rate. This has been known for a long time. Art Laffer was not the first supply-sider, or not the first person to notice this. He just popularized it very well in the early 1980s. But when it comes to presidential administrations that have taken advantage of this, because we have had in our past times with very high tax rate regimes, and there's been several times in our history where we've cut rates, broadened the base, and seen increases in government revenue. And if I were to ask you, well, what presidential regimes oversaw supply-side tax cuts, you might be familiar with Ronald Reagan back in the 80s. He was not the first by far. Go back to the 1960s. In the Democrat administration of John F. Kennedy, same exact kind of policies initiated. And then go even farther back into the 1920s, early in the federal income tax period, and rates had already crept way up during and after World War I. And supply-side policies of cutting rates, broadening the base, and growing government revenue and the economy were actually initiated by President Calvin Coolidge and his brilliant Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon. And you'll read a bit more about these policies in Thomas Sowell's book. Very interesting facts. a little bit counterintuitive if you don't understand the role that incentives and self-interest play in the determination of these things. Okay, now let's turn to the topic of federal spending. And again, we won't get very detailed. I'll just give you some broad numbers. I want to give you a sense of the parameters of the issue, and really we'll wind up by talking about the implication of the fact that tax revenues for the federal government have been consistently below their level of spending, and so we're accumulating large and growing deficits and a growing national debt burden. So I want to talk just briefly in conclusion here about what that means potentially for our economic future. Here's a chart of federal spending by the largest categories for 2016. Okay, we've got a total spending of about $4 trillion, and the big items of that spending are pensions, which would mostly be Social Security, healthcare, which for the federal government, the bigger chunk of this is Medicare, and also Medicaid for old people, Medicaid for poor people, education support at about $100 billion, defense at about $800 billion. Other welfare programs such as food stamps and AFDC, Section 8, cash benefits, etc., only about $400 billion. By far biggest federal spending is for entitlement programs, Social Security and Medicare, for old people. Now, the reason I bring that up is because we're observing here that federal spending is consistently and considerably higher than federal income, so we do have this issue of a deficit and debt building up. And if this is ever to be reversed, I'm very pessimistic that it will be. But if it ever is to be reversed, you're going to have to see some cuts in some of these programs. And for the cuts to be meaningful, they're going to have to be cuts to the big programs, Social Security and Medicare among them. Okay, so we have this issue of fiscal imbalance. The government is spending $4 trillion when its revenue is only a little bit more than $3.3 trillion. The answer, of course, is deficit spending. Government finances its deficit by borrowing money in the form of issuing new government bonds. Okay. And the deficit, you'll note here, refers to this annual gap between government spending and government revenue. This is the amount the government has to borrow in a given year to meet its planned spending levels. The debt is the accumulated borrowing over time. And for us, the accumulated borrowing is stretching back almost 200 years. The federal government actually did have its debt completely retired during the presidency of Andrew Jackson in the mid-1830s. And then after that, it started creeping back up again, and then it started rising at faster levels during periods of war. It came back down some, but really since about the year 2000, it's been growing pretty steeply. And it's now above 18 trillion. So going back to deficits, deficits were actually in fairly good shape under the W. Bush administration until the 2008 financial crisis and recession started hitting. They were falling. They were at a level of around $250 billion here in 05, 06, 07, and then they ballooned in 08 and then really just exploded in 09, 10, 11, 12. We had 4 years of $1 trillion plus deficits under the Obama administration, and even though those came back down as expected during the economic recovery period, and they actually did get down to kind of the W. Bush levels here in 14 and 15. They've actually turned the page and have started rising back up again in 2016's. I'll show you the number here in a minute. Is projected around 600 some billion. So we're actually back up on an increasing trajectory here, which is a little bit disheartening, given that we just added, about $5 or $6 trillion to our national debt in less than the last 10 years. Here's the debt. Now we want to think about debt as a percentage of GDP, because that scales the debt relative to the economy, and then it allows us to go back in time and say, when was the last time our debt was this severe? Okay. And a threshold of interest is 100% of GDP. And what this says is the government owes as much money as the entire output of the economy in a year. Last time that happened, you'll notice, was in the mid-1940s. And what's going on there? Well, a major national emergency, a major world emergency, where the government borrows massive amounts of money to finance the largest military mobilization ever, to defeat the bad guys and really rid the world of some terrible regimes. So is it understandable that the debt to GDP ratio skyrockets during this period of war? Yes, and note that after the war ends and we demobilize and military spending is cut dramatically, the debt to GDP ratio comes right back down, continues falling through peacetime, actually even through other periods of war, the Vietnam War, Korean War, and bottoms out in the 1980s. Now, there is an issue here with supply-side economics. They cut taxes and increased government revenue during the 1980s, So it's not a matter that government didn't have solid revenue growth here. The problem was that they forgot to cut spending, and military spending in particular during the Reagan years and the arms buildup. Now, regardless of whether you think that was a good policy or not, whether that was necessary to defeat the Soviet Union and win the Cold War, that's kind of a separate issue. The point is that deficit did start growing again in peacetime, and that was somewhat unprecedented. Deficit was actually reduced quite remarkably in the late 90s, during the Clinton administration and the congressional leadership of Gingrich, and we had a fairly stable debt burden up until roughly the financial crisis recession 08-09, and that's where we saw the debt levels explode again. And now we've reached this kind of scary level of having a debt at 100% of GDP. Note, this is in peacetime. This is a debt level that we'd not experienced previously except in wartime. To give you a sense of the magnitude and the pace of accumulation of this government debt, let's look at the U.S. debt clock. There's several websites that show this data. This is one of my favorite ones because it shows a lot of extra information. It's actually almost overwhelming, but you can see here the national debt stands at 19.3 trillion. There's the deficit. That's accumulated in real time for the current fiscal year. That'll hit above 600 billion. Federal spending, again, that's being accumulated in real time for the fiscal year. That'll hit about 4 trillion. So we've got a large and growing national debt. The question is it an excessive debt? Is our debt burden excessive? Lots of people have debts. Lots of businesses have debts. Debts are manageable. Debts are not inherently evil. Debts can enable you to accomplish things that you otherwise wouldn't accomplish. So I'm not one that's inherently anti-debt. We do have to say at what level is this debt dangerous? At what level is it unsustainable? At what level does it represent a fiscal danger? Well, there's a lot of debate about that. We're not in fiscal crisis now. And who knows, we might be able to go on for decades more, accumulating even larger debt. There are industrialized, stable economies that have debt to GDP ratios considerably larger than the current ratio for the United States. So it's a little bit of anyone's guess as to at what level this debt truly does become a major and significant problem. Although I think it's just wise and good foresight to say that, hey, at the rate we're accumulating this, we are ultimately reaching a point where the debt becomes excessively large. Something's going to have to give in order to correct this, because no entity, not even the United States Congress, can go on accumulating debt at an increasing pace forever. And there are two reasons we want to be wary of this buildup of government debt. Two problems government debt can bring. One is the imposition of higher future taxes. The only way for a government to pay off a growing debt is to collect more revenue. The only way for the government to collect more revenue is to raise taxes on its citizens. The problem with higher taxes for the economy, remember, if you tax something you get less of it. We increase tax rates on income. All taxes fall on some form of income. We're going to get less income, and income comes through work, so we get less work, less production, less investment, less creation of goods, slower economic growth. So higher taxes, and the kind of taxes we would need to meet our current debt burden, would arguably cripple the economy and really kill off any future economic growth. Another issue with debt is not just the fact that the needed increase in taxes will kill off your economic growth. The interest payment alone on debt can become a punishingly large fraction of the government, and it can actually crowd out all other things that the government wants to do. Going back to usgovernmentspending.com, and here's the data. The federal government's interest burden right now is at $240 billion per year. That's on a debt of $19 trillion, and that's with relatively low interest rates. If interest rates double, this doubles, and it's not out of the question for interest rates to rise eventually. They're at actually historically low levels right now, and so the interest component of federal spending will grow and grow and grow, and it potentially stands to become the single largest government spending, quote, program. Of course, it's not like other government spending programs, at least with these programs, defense, healthcare, welfare, etc. You get something. You get some kind of political objective out of it, some kind of income transfer to some kind of constituency. Whether worthy or not, those are political questions. For interest on the debt, you don't get anything. You just get the privilege of having overspent in the past. So the prospect of interest expenses growing and kind of eating up the rest of the federal budget is something that should not be ignored. And there are some cautionary tales that we should pay attention to. You get to a point where the government has really exhausted its capacity to borrow, and it could become a very sudden decline into a fiscal crisis, where if the government attempts to continue borrowing, you have a sudden crisis and economic collapse. This has happened before, not too long ago, in the case of Greece, Argentina. And when this happens, economies collapse, unemployment rates skyrocket, inflation takes off, and it's a very ugly picture, something we really don't want to happen. So this is why we want to keep an eye on that deficit and debt number. Pray for some kind of positive reform to happen, both to government spending, to get that spending under control, to stop the growth of the deficits and debt, and for tax reform, so the collection of revenue for the government doesn't have to be so much of a burden or drag on economic growth. So let me wrap up with a fundamental fiscal principle. All government spending must ultimately be paid for by some form of taxation. This is just another version of the saying that there's no such thing as a free lunch. Government has basically three options when it's financing its spending. Direct taxation, which I call the open and honest method, wherein the government levies taxes right now that match the amount of spending it wants to do right now. From an accounting and finance perspective, this is a sensible way to spend. Of course, our government is somewhat addicted to deficits, but remember that deficit spending implies higher future taxes or lower future spending. I think lower future spending is out of the question, so we're going to see some form of higher taxes in our lifetimes. Of course, that's politically unpopular and perhaps economically unfeasible. There's only so much you can raise the tax before you start to get up into that prohibitive range of the Laffer curve, and you actually don't collect more revenue beyond a certain point. So then what do you do? If you can't get your house in order, if you can't get your spending under control, and you want to keep on borrowing and keep on deficit spending, your ultimate option is the resort to the printing press. The government printing money to finance its obligations. And as we've seen, as you'll recall from previous lectures, we've seen this in U.S. history. What that does is leads to pretty destructive inflation. And it could be the case of the government printing the money directly, as we saw during the Civil War with the greenbacks. It could be the case that the government uses its central bank to print money and then uses that money to buy government bonds in a kind of a vicious cycle known as debt monetization. Now that's a little bit more complex way of doing this, but its ultimate effects are going to be exactly the same. We print more money, that causes inflation. Inflation, remember, is a tax. It's a tax on both late recipients of new money and on creditors. It benefits debtors at the expense of creditors. Well, if you think about who is the single largest debtor entity ever, really, in the history of the universe, well, that's the U.S. government. So they stand to benefit tremendously as a debtor from a burst of high unexpected inflation. It's kind of an insidious tax that can be collected by the government without anybody in Congress having to vote for it or any president needing to sign a bill to increase tax rates. And this is a last resort for over-indebted governments. It causes inflation, and remember, inflation is a tax. So there's no way around it. You're going to have to pay the tax in one form or another. We could be honest about it right now. We could pay it currently right now. Tax 1, as I like to call it. We could defer taxes into the future and suffer higher future tax rates. Tax 2. Or if our political leadership does not have the fortitude to rein in spending and stop borrowing, we'll ultimately go down the road of fiscal crisis and inflationary finance, which I like to call tax 3. There's no escaping the taxes. All government spending has to ultimately be paid for by some form of taxation. I don't want to be an alarmist here, but I do want us to be prepared down the road for this eventuality. This is something that kind of should be on your radar screen, and we want to pay close attention to these inflation rates and be able to position ourselves accordingly so that should fiscal crisis come, it doesn't catch us blindsided. That'll wrap it up for our little brief unit here on fiscal policy. I hate to end on such a gloomy and down note, but this is the reality we face. But I hope that having this little bit of knowledge of economic performance, inflation, government finance will help you develop some economic wisdom for both managing your own finances, managing your business, and just being a savvy, economically informed citizen, prepared to live through times of potential economic turmoil. God be with you all. It's been a great pleasure having you in the class, and best wishes in your future endeavors.